Empathic statements tap out the patient's feelings. That is, present statements of possible feelings that the patient hears and can affirm or deny. Restatements test the fixity of feelings by varying accounts. For example, whether the feelings persist through different situations, and their depth by deepening the expressions of feeling to successively greater or lesser extremes until the patient objects. Now note the value of not asking questions. Note the value of not asking questions, such as, do you feel sad? Questions demand a less reflexive response than statements. They also call up associations to examinations, personal inquiries, accusations of doing right or wrong, increasing the psychological distance between questioner and question. What works more reliably are words chosen to be close to simple affective states, at the same moment, tested for and shared. I won't need to illustrate very much what are meant by empathic statements, but you say things that are objectively presented as possible states of mind of the patient. You must be very sad. There seems nowhere to turn. Everything seems hopeless. You may want to die, for example. Now, what I mean by restatements are efforts to vary the level of the intensity of the affect tested for to see whether the patient will follow us and how far. For example, you say to the patient, you may feel hopeless, and the patient says, I was ready to kill myself, and you say, you may feel that way still. Then this patient hesitated, and then I said, there seems nowhere to go, and then the patient said, no, I'm not so alone now. Similar statements can be made about rage, one of the most difficult affects for us to deal with forthrightly. In order to test the extent of rage, I suggest taking empathy with rage up to the point where the patient may say, don't be so paranoid, doc. This is done by successively mentioning further possible sources of paranoid intrusion on the patient. And such a sequence has the paradoxical effect of reducing the patient's rage through sharing, that is, dividing and apportioning between the parties, as well as testing the limits of that rage. Now, the significance of these procedures is threefold. First, a baseline level of feeling is approximated that facilitates mapping future changes, for example, as results of medication. Second, it becomes easier to separate normal from abnormal feelings by testing their duration, occurrence in appropriate and inappropriate situations, and, because the tester acknowledges the particular feelings, by lessening the patient's need to impress them on the examiner. Such, as we all know, is a vexing problem of all reports. That is, to determine the extent to which the report is an attempt to manipulate the transaction. Finally, a detailed acknowledgement of the other's feeling states is equivalent to an acknowledgement of the person. This regularly improves the alliance. Now, closely related to establishing an alliance with the person is determination of the person's state of will, what may also be termed personal agency, selfhood, central intactness, or self-possession. And see here how I'm trying to get a hold on the location and determination of normal functions so that we can delimit the area of our pathological attributions. In the determination of the state of the patient's will, symptomatic phenomena are obviously very important. For example, dissociative states, scattered thoughts, projective symptoms, and feelings of emptiness are reflections of changed states of will. However, testing procedures confirm or deny symptomatic impressions. One wants a rough estimate of the strength and intactness of will. Now, a significant measure of the strength of will is the extent of the patient's imagined future. Does the patient imagine a future at all? Is it only the present extended? Wishes, wants, intentions refer to possible contents of the future. Are these present, and to what extent are they believed in? Note that the future is a neglected aspect of the evaluation of patients, with the exception of suicidal concerns. Yet futures in the form of volition, will, or intentions comprise a central part of personhood, often what people care chiefly about. At present, the concept of a personal future in our everyday work is replaced by the idea of prognosis, the course of diseases. Again, the pathological element thrusts aside any consideration of normal function. Here are a series of statements tapping into the strength of the will, again analogous to successive reflex testings of efficient function. I go now from a more diminished future to less diminished future. There seems no future to someone in despair, for example. The future is very limited. You can imagine what you want. You are able to imagine what you want. Or at the strongest level of personal futures, it is only a matter of gaining the courage to get what you want or take what you want. Any one of these might represent the present state of a will. The purpose of making the statements is to find the point of agreement or resonance. Wants or intentions constitute the specific contents of will. Asking about wants, however, can be unproductive because many patients do not feel entitled to have wants of their own. For example, they may feel free only to serve other people's wants. Still others are ashamed of what they want. Therefore, inquiries into wants are best indirect. For example, what you want may not seem possible or right. No one attends to your wants, or you are the one who attends to others. We can describe such statements as possible acknowledgments of others' states of mind in the area of will. However, a balanced account of will requires testing more than the strength of will, because will can be blind, or what is called thoughtless or unthinking. An example of blind will is, of course, mania or severe depression, in which the patients are able to consider only triumph or disaster. On the other hand, the reflective will is capable of containing varied possibilities. These should be carefully listened to in any clinical evaluation. For example, patients correcting his or her previous statements, modifying extreme statements, or raising doubts, etc. If these evidences of reflective will are not present, statements can be submitted for correction, such as doubts occurred to you, you wondered if this was the whole story, or is this the whole story? It is, I'm sure many of you have experienced the reassurance of hearing from patients who have given extreme accounts of their situations, commenting and correcting those accounts subsequently. In summary, these analogies to reflex testing or percussion make three central additions to routine clinical work. First, their ability to test impressions provides a partial escape from dependence on patients' reports. Second, they permit a crude discrimination of normal from abnormal functions, thereby beginning this objective delineation of disease states, a step critical in the development of medicine as a whole. Finally, attention to healthy in addition to diseased functions encourages acknowledgement of the person in the patient and an effective relationship with that person. In closing, in this way, we can learn to talk and to listen, not only for therapeutic purposes, but to achieve reliable judgments in practice. Thank you.
Thank you, Les. We have time for a couple questions.
When you would do this during an evaluation, would you tell the patient, now we're going to be going through some testing, or do you just use these sort of declarative statements through the course of your evaluation?
I use them to evaluate impressions of affect or will or other things that I'm getting. Just as when, you know, you can see the obvious parallels for percussion, for example, in lung and heart conditions, where you have something pointing to an area of your interest. It's done very easily and becomes quite automatic, and I don't for a moment expect that it could be easily become habitual. When I was a young resident, I once had to take the patient's x-rays down to the bottom of the Peter Bent Brigham Hospital, where they used to keep the radiologist, and over the door of the professor of radiology's office was a plaque on which had been hammered in a stethoscope. And you can perhaps guess what that plaque said underneath the stethoscope. It said, an instrument once used in the practice of medicine. And the radiologists took their revenge on the internists. They were kept in the basement. They took their revenge on the internists with this kind of a thing. And those of you who know the history of auscultation know that it was very difficult to introduce it to medicine, because people wanted to use their beautiful white handkerchiefs to put their ear next to the patient's chest. So that, but I really do urge that we take a step in this direction, so that we escape our genuinely pathetic dependence, on patients' reports. How we could have gone from an era when we were predominantly psychoanalytic in our academic world, and the whole idea of patients' reports was delegated to nonsense, right, to a time when we are totally dependent on them again.
I just want to say, I think it's a great idea, but I'd add one caveat, is that it seems like it'd be very important to understand the cultural context from which the patient comes from, so that the words that you pick will have different affective meanings depending on the particular background of the patient.
Oh, I think that's a very important point. And by the way, the cultural problem in relationship to percussion and reflex testing was a very significant one too. And there were places where it was not permitted to lay on one's hands with the intimacy that the cardiologists, for example, did. But that's very much the case, I'm sure.
Well, I think it's a very interesting approach. I just want to know whether you consider other possible things that seem in line, like sex depression inventory or standard measures of attachment and loss in young children, that kind of thing.
I didn't mean that these routine clinical measures excluded or replaced the use of all kinds of testing procedures, which are of immense value to us, and you give some good examples of others. But I'm saying that I'm trying to persuade us to modify our pathetic dependence on the reports in view of our psychological sophistication, interactive and unconscious effects, so that we have working ways of stabilizing, especially in the direction of the recognition of health.
I think this is fascinating, but I would wonder too, not to challenge what you're saying, but to wonder, doing it in a statement, you're still getting the patient's report, and you're still possibly dealing with unconscious phenomenon that maybe there's an unconscious reason why the patient resonates at a certain point when you say a statement, or doesn't resonate at a certain point that might be accurate because of unconscious reasons.
Well, I think that's a very important restriction on the value of it that you're calling attention to. But I've had a lot of experience with this over a good many years now, and I'm very struck by the freedom and spontaneity of responses to statements as opposed to question reporting things. And I'm sure you're in part right. But I think there still is a gain in terms of the reliability of the material.
All right, one more.
Les, do you think you can get this to a place where it can be standardized, to put in something that can be measured numerical values? Because that seems to be the only thing anybody believes in. And even when you started out, you said that that's what distinguished a new era, when we got something we could measure specifically if this is normal and this is not normal in terms of numerical statements that are reproducible?
Well, I don't expect it can be made, Harry. I don't think it can be made numerically clear. No more than percussion can. No more than reflex testing is. This is an early stage. Eventually we might be able to get there, probably by means of ancillary measures like brain imaging. But I think until we can organize our reliability of responses, validity of responses to greater, I'm not sure, as I said, that we can even use the more sophisticated tests of brain imaging.
Okay, thank you, Les. Dr. Kramer.
I hope you're enjoying this afternoon as much as I am, and that's saying a great deal when one is about to give a talk. I am bursting with things to say. I think this is a time that is full of new reflections. But I have written a talk, and I think that maybe the proper thing to do is to keep the strands separate for a bit longer. I think you'll hear plenty of resonance with what has come before. I wanted to begin by saying what an honor it is to be part of this afternoon. I've known Leston Havens since my days in medical school when over 20 years ago he mentored me on an independent study with the ambitious title, How People Change. And I've admired his work ever since. I think of all contemporary writing in psychotherapy, his is most likely to endure, and I think this new twist is going to be very important. I came to know Bob Michaels of him at about the same time through his innovative textbook in psychiatry, which was already talking about matching psychotherapeutic skills to diagnosis, if I remember it right. And I later consulted him on federal programs related to psychotherapy when I was working in the federal government. So these are my teachers. The other participants, Leston Havens' daughter Jennifer Havens and her husband Peter Wyden, represent the future, presumably the integration of the independent tradition of psychotherapy with modern neuroscience, a task that their generation, I'm sure, will accomplish. So this is a touching and resonant moment for me. In trying to determine what would be an adequate response to the moment, I decided that the appropriate act in the spirit of Dr. Havens' work in particular, Leston Havens, would be to let my mind wander freely and to end by entertaining an unlikely thought. Some months back, I chose for this talk the title, The Shape We're In, to signal an overview built around a metaphor, namely the topography of the field. I want, before going on off on various tangents, not to give that talk, but to put on the table its gist or conclusion. A frequent view of psychotherapy is that it encompasses a plethora of theories, but that what psychotherapists of differing schools actually do varies little. They listen and talk. Some studies indicate that a few years out of practice, psychotherapists tend to listen and talk in similar ways. My fashion of summarizing this view is to say that psychotherapy is theory-rich, but technique-poor. I take this view to be right on its own terms, but to contain a problem with regard to distance taken from the phenomena. As a clinician, I find that I have to hand a plethora of techniques. It makes a great difference to me, not least because I believe it makes a difference for my patients, whether I respond to an impasse through an enhanced effort at empathic attunement, or through a counterprojective maneuver, or through hypnotic joining and leading, or through didactic coaching. Technique needs to be judged close up, the way it feels to clinicians. As a clinician, I'm happy to have many techniques. I have many theories as well. That business is right enough. But it's in the nature of theory for its proliferation to be troubling. What I want is a more complete and unified way of understanding the person in front of me. I want an integration of theory so that it feels to me in my everyday work that psychotherapy is technique-rich but theory-poor. This understanding, if it's right, presents a special difficulty for a leading form of psychotherapy, psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis is self-justification in light of its cumbersomeness, is not that it offers an extensive collection of techniques that forgoes many that seem powerful in the immediate term, but rather that it represents a comprehensive theory of human emotion and behavior, buttressed by a special language or way of thinking that contains that theory. The standing of its theory may seem at the moment the least of psychoanalysis's problems. Psychoanalysis is under attack from the outside. The onslaught includes complaints about the practice of psychoanalysis, including accusations of frank or implicit abuse of trust. Disparagement of the tradition of psychoanalysis, including aspersions on the character of the discipline's founder and icon, and questions regarding the efficacy of the undertaking. Psychoanalysis's traditional response to this sort of challenge has been that it remains the best elaborated human psychology, but that status is precisely what is in doubt, so that the internal and external problems of psychoanalysis seem to me inextricably linked. I want to look at a detailed example of this linkage, but first a few more words of overview. Psychoanalysis has been having difficulties with the self. The technique of psychoanalysis, the intimate encounter, has taught practitioners what philosophers have known for decades, that the self is a slippery concept. Contrary to what it often feels like in daily life, in psychoanalysis, the self appears at least discontinuous and perhaps ephemeral. In particular, the self seems subject to influence, so that the behavior of the analyst helps to determine the self that emerges. All psychoanalysis turns out to entail what is now called countertransference enactment. The patient is not so much revealed as created. And this problem is magnified in a therapy that relies on memory, since memory seems to consist not, as was once thought, of traces useful for reconstruction of a past, but of schemata prone to unreliable elaboration in the present. This loss of self in psychoanalysis, and the problem is no less in self-psychology, where the problem becomes which self one is empathizing with. This loss of self occurs simultaneously with a reification of self through psychopharmacology. That is, the efficacy of medication seems to tell us that aspects of the self that have strong ties to mood, shyness, rejection sensitivity, obsessionality, and the like, are relatively fixed. So that what psychoanalysis considers epiphenomenal, such as symptoms and mood state, is looking solid, just when what psychoanalysis considers solid, such as memory and structure of mind, is looking evanescent. Problems of this sort confront all of psychotherapy. Everyone understands that psychotherapy must take into account neuropsychiatry once neuropsychiatry stands still long enough for everyone to get his arms around it. But they're especially urgent for psychoanalysis because of this intention to be comprehensive, and because aspects of its method demand that it be comprehensive. For example, I'm thinking of the assertion that anything that interferes with the course of the analysis must be interpreted as the resistance. What I think is less obvious is that problems of the sort I'm alluding to extend into the details of theory, language, and perspective of psychoanalysis. I propose to spend a moment thinking about one concept, projection, and I hope we understand what's meant by that, the unconscious rejection of one's unacceptable thoughts, feelings, and wishes, and the attribution of them to other people. I take projection to be at the core of psychoanalysis because it's the defense most relevant to transference, which is the sine qua non of analytic treatment. I happen to think a good deal about projection recently because of work with a mildly paranoid patient. Projection is also the defense most intimately associated with paranoia. Briefly put, according to psychoanalysis, the action of paranoia is projection. But what are the grounds for that belief? In the era of animal ethology and evolutionary psychology, we have no need of that hypothesis. After all, animals can, through simple traumatic or pharmacologic means, be made hypervigilant, anxious, impulsively aggressive, and the like. Paranoia seems a simple, non-specific psychobiological state. There is no necessary thought associated, and in particular, there's no necessary fantasy about the self that's rejected as threatening to the ego and attributed to the other. If a patient suspects the analyst, the patient may do so quite simply and without reference to unacceptable aspects of self. What makes the matter worse is that even when paranoia does entail projection, that observation is of limited use in the clinical setting. If structure and self are unreliable and discontinuous, if they're often the result of countertransference enactment, what an analysis of projection has to say about the patient is of uncertain import. Or rather, such an analysis may be of some utility, but only after a substantial effort to determine the extent to which its conclusions are generalizable beyond the encounter at hand. So that paranoia may not express projection, at least not projection of a particular fantasy, and where it does entail projection, that truth may not lead us directly to the paranoid person. The matter was quite otherwise a century ago, but when we see how it was otherwise, new concerns may arise for us. Freud refers to projection as early as 1895 in correspondence with Wilhelm Fliess at the outset of Freud's conceptualization of psychoanalytic theory. Freud is, in fact, discussing paranoia and making it out to be like hysteria, a pathological mode of defense against the unacceptable. Is any of our present difficulty visible from the inception? Freud's case example concerns a single woman about age 30 who has developed delusions of observation and persecution. She believes that the neighbors pity her, hinting that she was jilted by a former boarder, a social acquaintance who some years prior had briefly taken a room in the family home. The patient's older sister has informed Freud of a troubling incident involving this boarder, which Freud reports thus. The younger sister had been doing out the room when the boarder was still lying in bed. He had called her up to the bed, and when she had unsuspectingly obeyed, put his penis in her hand. There had been no sequel to this scene. The man moved away, and in time the woman was troubled by periodic paranoid symptoms. When asked by the older sister, the younger now denies the boarder ever approached her sexually. Freud tries to treat the paranoid younger sister by bringing her memory back to the scene, but without success. For Freud, the defensive maneuver is obvious. He writes, "Something was repressed, and we can guess what that was. She had probably, in fact, been excited by what she had seen and by recollecting it. So what she was sparing herself was the self-reproach of being a bad woman." It is this reproach that she transposes and projects. The woman is wrestling with her desire, her self-pity she attributes to others. This mechanism, Freud says, applies equally to all other cases of paranoia. Now, I don't want to make too much of this question of origin. We might own the idea of paranoia as being characterized by projection without owning Freud's understanding of this example, and we might find use for the notion of projection without making it a universal feature of paranoia. What is clear is that this case, so compelling to Freud, is compelling to us in quite different ways. Perhaps I'm only projecting my own ignorance onto the profession when I say that, for starters, we do not know what to make of this patient. Nor, after 100 years of progress in psychiatry, am I confident that were the woman here before us, we would be any wiser. In the era of the false memory debate, we are likely to be less convinced than Freud that the sexual episode took place at all. Certainly, we may wonder whether it took place in just the way that it's been reported. Perhaps the younger sister's illness extends further back than the older sister knows, so that the bedroom scene is not the cause, but the result of paranoia. Or perhaps the problem is that aspects of the story are missing. The woman may have been approached by the boarder more often than has so far been admitted, isolated instances of molestation being the exception rather than the rule. I call it molestation because today we're likely to see the approach as abusive rather than inviting, and I suspect that even in Freud's day, this would have been the conventional view of the matter. Perhaps the older sister has also been approached. After all, she readily believes the report. Was she herself involved with the boarder? And speaking of family dramas, surely we wonder whether this molestation is not a return to prior trauma, so that, taking the other side of the false memory debate, we will be open to the possibility that the younger sister was traumatized in childhood as well. Alternative accounts will come to mind involving the role of the older sister, the neighbors, and even Freud, who's been accused in other instances of doctoring the facts rather than the patient. But considering only the range of history as I've outlined, that the younger sister was never molested and just has a progressive paranoid disorder, or that she was molested repeatedly, I suspect that today we are more open to the ends of the spectrum than to the notion that the whole of the illness can be traced to a single morning. In other words, it is either paranoia or something like post-traumatic stress disorder that brings the relationship with the boarder to the fore of the patient's imagination, causes her to latch on to gossip over the boarder as a way of explaining a disorganizing inner feeling. That feeling state, perhaps with both genetic and traumatic contributors, is the proper target of any therapy today. According to this modern view, the projection, to the extent that it occurs, is likely incidental and nonspecific, an unreliable indicator of what troubles this woman. And what exactly can be said to be projected? That is, what is denied? Here we may disagree with Freud outright if we take him by excited to mean that the younger sister was sexually aroused by the boarder's approach. Humiliated seems more likely, or terrorized. If she had any foolish hopes, they were dashed rather than awakened. This disagreement with Freud I take possibly to be crucial and not incidental. When we use the term projection, we risk standing in a prosecutorial relationship to the patient, accusing the patient of mens rea, the guilty mind. And for psychoanalysis to justify the complexity of its method, what the mind is guilty of ought often to be something unexpected, non-obvious, dark. To a degree, the concept of projection justifies the patient's paranoia in her therapy. This belief that in projecting, the patient is likely denying intolerable thoughts regarding her own impulses leads to all sorts of dicey speculation. This perspective that includes projection has become troubled, so that reform of psychoanalysis is not just a matter of, say, jettisoning castration anxiety and penis envy, but maintaining the process and structure of the treatment. The process and structure are suspect of being related to untenable content. Regarding Freud's case 100 years later, we are unable to get far beyond the facts that the younger sister believes she's being talked about, and the older sister believes there's a story behind the younger sister's agitation. What is worse, we know that were we present, we would have little hope of getting closer to the facts, because some opinion of ours as therapists would leak out so that our own prejudgments, like Freud's, would muddy the field of inquiry. We might hope to do better than Freud in this sense, that we might arrive with a patient at a common story, and the journey to that story might do the patient some good. This is technique again. Our inquiry might ignore projection entirely, or it might entail our joining the patient in her projection. We can see Leston Havens sitting beside the younger sister and hearing her complain of the neighbors he might utter, "Those damn busybodies," as both an empathic statement and a counter-projective maneuver, a way of indicating I am not Freud, and maybe as a way of locating her affect and her flexibility of will. But unlike the surgeons Freud was wont to refer to in metaphor, we would not hope to arrive at what was initially inside the patient. Certainly, we would not expect an examination of projection to lead us there. I have not proved, but I hope I've aroused the suspicion that projection is a difficult, perhaps even a tainted concept. It contains dated ideas about who knows what, how encounters usefully occur, why illness or personality styles arise, what lies at the end of an inquiry or treatment. This is not to say that projection never occurs, surely it does, but that attention to it is likely to be misleading, especially if we expect it to conduct us to historical truth or solid self. This casting of doubt upon the centrality or utility of projection may seem unimportant, because psychoanalysis has already demoted projection in favor of projective identification, or in a calculated move toward imprecision, enactment. These newer concepts do correspond better to contemporary views of what's likely to be fruitful in treatment, but we would want to know what assumptions ground these terms. And I'm not going to go into that, but to say, in particular, I want to know how universal we take to be the proposition that what is projected or enacted is unconscious fantasy, because contemporary science offers us alternative models of how powerful interpersonal behaviors, even self-injurious ones, might arise. I have in mind a series of studies by David Rees and Robert Plomin, the geneticist, to examine the settings in which children are reared. Comparing the familial experiences of siblings of different degrees of genetic propinquity, Rees has found that a child's genes shape the child's environment. This result is counterintuitive. We ordinarily imagine that parents mold children much more than the reverse, but it looks now that there are genetically modulated child effects in such areas as parental warmth, control, inconsistency, and especially conflict, extending to such parental behaviors as severe punishment and verbal violence. Part of what looks like nurture may be the child's nature expressed in parental reactions. It is not clear how a child's genes influence the way a child is treated. Perhaps the genes increase the odds that a child will be a certain way, hypersensitive, impulsive, obsessive, aggressive, or timid, and each way of being selects different behaviors from the parental repertoire. It is, of course, possible that the genes determine the sort of mental images a child develops, and that those images influence the child's behavior and then the parents, but on the whole, genetic models suggest something broader, like temperament, which helps to shape the child's environment at every stage. To look at a limited example of what Rees proposes, hyperactivity in children is in part hereditary. Parents of hyperactive children tend to be controlling and negative, unresponsive even to positive communication from these children. Teachers and peers have similar responses. If a medication reduces the symptoms of a hyperactive child, thus mitigating heredity, the child's parents treat the child differently. Rees's findings suggest a model of interpersonal influence that is distant from the model of projective identification and enactment. One could hypothesize that hyperactive children have an inner template of the unresponsive caregiver and project that template onto parents, inducing the relevant behavior, but that idea seems disrespectful and unnecessary. As with Freud's take on the paranoid younger sister, it seems to blame the victim. After all, when impulsive behaviors are said to be unconsciously motivated, the usual claim is that children want more intense, not less intense parental responses. Hyperactive children just have trouble controlling their behavior. The family they get does not correspond to an internal wish or map, it corresponds to the behavior and to a somewhat limited array of responses for parents in this culture to persistent impulsivity. When medicine reshapes the families through decreasing the child's hyperactivity, although the child's wishes, images, and needs certainly will change as the child focuses better. This odd notion that family process is in part genetic and that the relevant genes are not just the parents but also children's has ramifications for the way we see the child and the family's development. I mention it for the most limited of reasons. It points to a model of small group interaction that has nothing to do with projective identification. People create their social environment through repetitive behaviors that do not reflect unconscious conflict or internal images. I hope that the analogy I have in mind is apparent. In adulthood and in psychotherapy, a person may elicit identical responses from partner after partner or therapist after therapist. The question is whether that sculpting relates to a fixed mental image, hostile mother, mercurial father, and the like, or even introjective object relations or attempts to repair deficits brought on by empathic ruptures. There's reason to believe that they may not always. People can be self-defeating without being neurotic. As in Darwinian theories of development, a building does not imply a blueprint. So that we may be left finally with an analytic posture, one that demands a therapist be keenly aware of enactments between patient and therapist, but our understanding of what might explain these enactments will need to be broadly eclectic. We will want to be most skeptical of what were once central beliefs about the implications of such enactments. My detours into an odd case of Freud's and an odd line of genetic research are a long way of saying what should in any case be obvious, that there is an imperative for modern psychoanalysis, and perhaps for many another school of psychotherapy, to inventory its theory, language, and perspective in light of contemporary models of self, mind, and causation. And here is my fantasy, that the task might be undertaken, as it were, from the inside. Some might say that psychoanalysis does that all the time. Looking, for example, to self-psychology, one sees a willingness to do without most of the apparatus of classical psychoanalysis. I have two problems with this response. The first is that I'm not certain it's true. The assumptions inherent in psychoanalysis are so pervasive that it's difficult to know which ones remain. For example, it seemed that Heinz Kohut had already thrown over the traces, but the rise of the intersubjective school, essentially an attempt to purge the Freudianism remaining in Kohut, is proof that he did not. The second problem is that upon shedding the vocabulary and assumptions of psychoanalysis, one has abandoned psychoanalysis, and my fantasy is of a different sort of critique, one that evolves from sitting beside psychoanalysis empathically and looking at its developmental impasses together. To put the matter slightly differently, psychoanalysis seems to progress, or at least to change, by two equally unsatisfactory methods. One I've just alluded to, throwing over the traces, proclaiming a revolution. This method has its characteristic shortcomings. Often the degree of difference is exaggerated, so that claims of novelty are made for shop-worn ideas. And to the degree that the change really is thorough, what results is only another new therapy, one of dozens, without the gravitas provided by adequate links to the best developed metapsychology in the field. The second method of progress in psychoanalysis, gradualism, generally entails an inadequate critique of what has come before. Outsiders have reason to mistrust revolutionary change in psychoanalysis, as we would mistrust a young adult or a society that did not to some degree own and wrestle with the sins of the fathers. How do we know that mistakes of the same magnitude are not being repeated? What is called for metaphorically is some combination of pride, allegiance, understanding, shame, forgiveness, and resolve, but shame is a necessary part of the mix. This, then, is my unlikely thought. The undertaking, I imagine, is difficult in this sense that there may be no such seat available alongside psychoanalysis. One is either uncritical friend or critical foe. Worse, there is no unitary psychoanalysis, only differing schools with differing investments. But I have the thought nonetheless, a fantasy of the profession saying with one voice, mea culpa, while at the same moment holding to what can be salvaged of family tradition. It is this salvage job that interests me. What can be made of the complex language that psychoanalysis has created? I envisage a sort of stripping away of what is untenable in the hopes that something might emerge that is beautiful in its transparency. I am not proposing myself as one who might undertake this task. I am finally not a psychoanalyst, but I would like to see the renovation proceed. This is an odd fantasy to choose, I know, in the midst of a battle. How can we be openly honest in the presence of enemies, from managed care companies to Freud bashers to psychobiological reductionists? Though perhaps this moment of devaluation presents an opportunity for a certain sort of nakedness. Humility, the virtue once called lowliness, is sometimes considered a prerequisite for self-cleansing. I propose to conclude in as arbitrary a fashion as I've proceeded so far by making an arbitrary case for psychotherapy, and psychoanalysis in particular. The case is simply an eclectic list of names. Think of Murray Bowen, Milton Erickson, Erik Erikson, Donald Winnicott, John Bowlby, Harry Stack Sullivan, Karen Horney, Eric Fromm, Frieda Fromm-Reichmann, Rollo May, Henry Dix, Carl Rogers, Carl Whitaker, Ronald Fairburn, Franz Alexander, Edith Jacobson, Helmut Kaiser. These are names of psychotherapists, mostly psychoanalysts, and you undoubtedly will have thought of others equally creative, who were active in the middle decades of this century when psychoanalysis was said to be at its most rigid. The modern writers whose work was available to Leston Havens and me as we approached that independent study about how people change. Any framework of thought that managed to accommodate and inspire thinkers of this caliber is worth refurbishing, but in some adequately serious way. This is my answer to the question implicit in this symposium: what is to be done? Not merely political action, not defense of the indefensible, not the proclamation of novel and pseudo-novel therapies, though new tools are always welcome, but rather a taking stock, disturbing though that prospect may be, to identify what of our heritage remains. This is also my answer to the question I have posed about the shape of the field. We are in sorry shape. Our field is unsettlingly amorphous, and the question is whether we will, through defensiveness, move toward further disintegration, or whether, as is occasionally the case in our clinical work, this condition signals a moment for self-examination, regrouping, and innovation that takes honest account of our history. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Questions? You knocked him out.
Dr. do you feel like that Dr. Havens kind of started that project with Models to Mind back
I think Dr. Havens, this is a book that reviews many perspectives in the history of psychiatry. I think it started a project that has in particular not especially been taken up by psychoanalysis. And it is frustrating. I think psychoanalysis is sort of a beautiful thing that becomes less and less rooted in contemporary reality. And I think that to practice in good faith is to accept the science of one's times. So that it's very difficult, I think, to, one has almost the experience of loving someone who increasingly refuses to enter the world. And this is not quite true. There are wonderful younger psychoanalysts, or not necessarily younger, but people writing right now, who have a sense of this project. But I don't know, I think by being particularly provocative, I intend to say something about the root and stock nature of the enterprise, that it extends to the very ordinary language that we don't think about. I had odd experiences at this conference. I'd written this talk, was kind of concerned about it, and I went to a case conference, a very fine case conference, and I heard about modifications of penis envy that were usable, and I thought, no, I don't think modifications of penis envy are usable. Why would we want to start there at all? And then I asked a question which unfortunately was incomprehensible because it contained lots of my thoughts bundled up.
We have reached the end of the material on this cassette. The program continues on part 2.